Hello again. Good afternoon. First of all, at City Club, we always appreciate making news and breaking news. And there was some big news that came out today. Apparently, Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift are engaged. So just want to make sure you heard it here first, folks. I have no idea if it's true or not, but we're going to find out soon. Thank you for being here during, obviously, this very important day. I'm Dan Gibbons from the City Club, and as I mentioned, on behalf of Dr. Ed Mazur and our board, you're all welcome, and we appreciate when you take time out of your day for these important conversations. We especially appreciate those who sponsor the events, 8 Hospitality and Carmen Rossi, the Office of the Inspector General, who I think we'll recognize again a little bit later, White and Company, of course, Pat Cermak and Matt, and some friends over here from the University Club, another home away from home for so many of us, and of course the Family Justice Initiative and the Beidler family. Thank you for your sponsorship. Thank you for being here today, along with so many other great leaders. Welcome back to one of our favorite City Club speakers, the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities, Rachel Arfa. Thank you, Rachel. I mentioned Pat and Matt Cermak and Rena Rinaldi from the University Club, all the great programs and the great topics that they're covering over there, just a few blocks away. Thank you for all your efforts. Dan Katowski, also some familiar faces for different places and different sectors. David Greising is here from the BGA. Thank you, David, for all your work and for all your support of City Club. We also have some students both from UIC and then also from the Harris School, and there's some alumni from the Harris School, Masters in Public Policy, who I know are interested in government efficiencies and accountability. So perhaps, Deb, we can gear our conversation a little bit towards that next generation of leaders. And maybe some of the lessons that you've learned. It's always good to have young folks in the room who are going to take up this mantle and move things forward. Darius Hillman's here from CAN-TV. Thank you, Darius, and we'll tune into your shows as well. Appreciate that. Meyer Blank is here. A great group of business, civic, philanthropy as usual. Definitely always appreciate your presence. So. I'm going to introduce, and we're going to have a conversation. As I mentioned, I do want to open it up to questions. So please think of some good ones. I have some pre-submitted ones on a bunch of loose papers here, which we'll get to if we don't have questions in the room. But I look forward to having this conversation and excited to have this conversation with the woman who has done so much to move Chicago forward and, of course, on the straight path and the narrow path, right? She's been the Inspector General for the City of Chicago since 2022. And before that was a Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety since 2016 and State's Attorney before that, Assistant State's Attorney previous to that. So if you would, please join me in welcoming back to the City Club a great civic leader, a great civil servant, Inspector General Deborah Witzburg. Thank you, Deb. I'm going to make sure this works.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to join us.
Always available for meals, Dan.
We know you, we appreciate that you're here often as a guest.
Yes.
And listening to other leaders and some of their initiatives. But you have such a unique perspective, into how this city works. And we appreciate your willingness to share that, some of that perspective, maybe some insights, like I mentioned. We have some young folks, perhaps even advice for some folks like that, for these emerging leaders and civil servants who are here with us. So thank you and welcome back.
Thank you.
There's no lack of news. There's no lack of topics to get into. Let's start with the topic of the day.
Yes.
And your background is in police oversight, right? I mean, pretty heavily public safety and police oversight. There's news this week that although crime in Chicago is down, that the Trump administration is considering ultimately what would be a forced oversight of the police department and of public safety by sending in the National Guard or troops or who knows to Chicago. Is that necessary in your opinion?
No. No. Chicago certainly continues to face challenges around public safety and policing and reform. I do not see a problem to which that is an appropriate solution.
And given your work with the police department and with public safety, numbers seem to be trending down. Is that the scenario from your perspective? I know others, may say that facts are wrong or numbers are off. You see a lot of data. You see a lot of work that you have done and your office has done to improve that reporting. Yeah. From your perspective, how are we doing on crime overall?
Let's just start with the easy questions here. I think there is certainly good news to be told on crime rates in the city. That is not to say that we are done with public safety. The experience of how safe people feel, that is not necessarily a story that gets told in the statistics. There's certainly good news to tell on crime rates. What is more challenging than measuring the rates, which as you note is challenging enough, is attributing cause. So crime rates are a little bit cyclical. They go up and they come down all over the place over time. What is challenging is to identify those things that are working, which lead to reductions in crime, so we can identify effective strategies. So there's good news on some crime rate data, and there's plenty of work left to do, both in how effective we are at keeping people safe and in how we go about doing that. And of course, those things are connected. Among the things that worries me most about the kind of public safety conversation in the city is that there continues to be what I think is a profoundly false binary where people sort of talk about this as though we can either be in the business of keeping people safe or we can do reform. And of course, that is not a choice between those two things. It is that we can only get better at keeping people safe if we reform the way we do policing.
And so would you say there have been some advancements in that reform? Would you be willing to take a little bit of credit for some of the crime stats going down?
No, I think...
it's very difficult on City Club platform to ask someone to take credit. They don't do it very often up here in politics and in city government. No is the short answer. But I think when we talk about the fact that there's this connection between how well we can keep people safe and how we go about reform, as you say, I was a Cook County prosecutor before I did this work, and it was my experience that we did not get convictions. We didn't lock up the bad guys because a police officer happened to be on a street corner to see something bad happen. Cases got solved because somebody trusted a police officer enough to tell them what happened. And for that reason and in that way, I think there is a very concrete, very linear, direct connection between the quality of the relationship between the police and the community, how much people trust the police, and how effective we are at public safety. And so because I think those things are so closely connected, I think there is every reason to expect and believe that the work of police accountability and public safety reform has had some impact on fostering public trust in policing, and for that reason, I think has likely made us more effective at public safety. Okay, and as I mentioned, I know that that's a lot in your background, so I started with that, but really, since 2022, you've stepped back and had the really responsibility to oversee all of city government, right? It's budget season. This is kind of
so I've heard. Yeah.
So you've heard. This is the time when the administration is going to roll out their priorities. I mean, a budget is not just numbers. It's a living, breathing manifest for government. What are you seeing in this budget? And not necessarily your budget, but the city budget and sort of the allocation of resources.
Well, allocation of resources is, I think, exactly the right question. I think in any budget-constrained environment, which government is and will always be, the decisions to be made are always going to be resource allocation decisions. It's never going to be a question of whether there are enough resources. More could always be done with more. This is always going to be a question of how we allocate the resources we have. That's even true on a department-by-department level. You know, when we look at things like police staffing, I'm sort of not a subscriber to the conversation about whether we have enough police officers. The conversation we ought to be having is how we allocate the ones we have. So to actually answer your question, I think this is a tremendously challenging budget season, obviously. I think that it will be the most challenging one in memory. And there certainly will be difficult choices to be made. The process around the city's budget, I think, is a very, very interesting one at this moment where in almost any sensible and clear-eyed assessment, the dynamics in City Hall and the kind of dynamics between the components and among the components of city government, the mayor's office, city council, et cetera, are changing. Those things look different than they used to. And so the process by which we reach the city's final budget will surely look different this year than it has before. I think probably gone forever are the days where the mayor's proposed budget gets 47 out of 50 votes in the city council.
Mm-hmm. And is that for the better, do you think?
I think, yes, I think it is for the better. I also think that those changing dynamics necessitate some adjustments in structure. You know, we very much have a city government that is built for a certain kind of executive leadership. And when the inputs to any, I use the word machine in like a lowercase m kind of way here, but when the inputs to any machine change, that changes the outputs too. And so where we have different kinds of relationships among and between people in power, that bodes for some adjustments in structure. And I'm not sure that the structure has quite caught up with the changing realities. And so there are, even leaving aside the kind of substantive challenges in the budget where we don't have enough revenue to meet our expenses, there are, I think, some procedural challenges as well in terms of how we get there.
So you know, you said you certainly can do more with more,
yeah.
Right? Can we do more with less?
Well, we're gonna have to. I mean, that's the challenge. There's some more to be done with less. There are absolutely efficiencies to be realized in city government. There's just no, in any budget, and certainly in this one, there are things that the city could do more efficiently. We could manage workforces more efficiently. We could make upfront investments in things like information systems, which would save downstream costs. There are all kinds of things we could do to save money. Some of those things are challenging in a year-by-year cycle because, as many of you, right, as people know in their own and in their sort of corporate lives, sometimes you have to invest money up front to save money down the road, and that can be challenging when the cycle is only a year long. But there is money to be saved. I also think the reality is that we're going to have to stop doing some things that we are doing. I don't think that a gap of $1 billion is going to get filled by realizing efficiencies, however real those efficiencies are.
And one of those things that you're mentioning, you're going to have to stop certain things, not that I'm suggesting, but that is stopping, is hiring. So much of the budget is in personnel,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
And no one likes to hear layoffs. No one likes to hear, efficiencies are all these words that, we can use, but ultimately it means fewer people being employed by the city government, right?
Yes.
And it seems to me that it's either that or some, mysterious growth in revenue that isn't quite there yet. So I'm hoping, I assume that in a lot of your investigations and a lot of your work, a lot of your insights, that you're able to help really point out what some of those efficiencies can be. And is anyone listening if you do point that out?
I wonder that myself. Yes, I think they are listening. I think that, we have over the last couple of years had more kind of engagement from the city council on our program and policy work than ever before. So we regularly have subject matter hearings before the city council. We've had quarterly hearings in the ethics committee on the quarterly reports of the office. And I think there really is an elevated focus on the work, that program and policy work we do, the work we do that is devoted to questions about whether city programs operate as effectively and efficiently and equitably as they might. So I think they are listening. I do think so.
And it's interesting you say they. I was just thinking more so the mayoral administration, but interesting that you bring in city council because historically we are a weak mayor government, right?
Well,
or structured as such.
Structured as such, maybe. I think that's maybe has not been historically an on-the-ground reality in a world where, for example, the mayor has historically selected committee chairs in city council. Those people have tremendous power to exercise over what gets legislated and when. And, a practical reality where those people are selected by the mayor, I'm not sure that in practice that's a weak mayor government.
And so by your assessment, the votes of, the lopsided votes are not, we've seen the last few years, they're certainly not there. Do you see the legislative branch stepping into power more and more as time goes on?
Yes, I do think we see efforts in that direction. I think we'll continue to see more. By no means do I think the dust has settled there, and that's probably not a linear change. That's probably not something that happens all in one direction, but I think we certainly are seeing signs of a different structural relationship between city council and the mayor's office.
And with that responsibility, has there come a better sense of responsibility and maybe how have you seen corruption up, down, sideways?
It's a growth industry. That's actually my husband's joke, and he's not here, so I'm just going to take credit. I'll take credit for it for today. Don't tell him. The Chicago way is a proper noun for good reason. Chicago has earned its legacy of misconduct and corruption in city government. And in a city where dozens of elected officials have been convicted of and pled guilty to crimes related to their official duties, that is how we've gotten where we are. I do think that, again, there's a little bit of good news to tell. So we recently undertook, with the tremendous partnership of some folks in this room, a legislative effort to strengthen OIG's effectiveness and independence. And that legislative change met with overwhelming support in the city council. And I think while there's plenty to worry about, it's important to say that an overwhelming majority of members of the Chicago City Council voted to strengthen the oversight to which they themselves are subject. And I think that's a good news story.
Great. So there are different stakeholders in this. City council certainly one of them. The mayor's office certainly one of them. I assume with a lot of your work, and especially on the investigative side, that organized labor is a big piece of that equation. How have your dealings been with organized labor? And this is now over 2 administrations. I assume the unions are there to defend and take care of their members, right? Many of whom you're looking at saying, hey, you can do things a little bit better.
A little bit better.
It's got to be a complicated relationship.
Yeah. Most of the contact that we have with labor unions representing city employees is in the context of our investigative work, and where people we are investigating are entitled to be represented at subject interviews, for example, by counsel and by their union representatives. And so we see on a kind of case-by-case, investigation-by-investigation level, we see the unions representing city employees that way. We also certainly interact at a policy level with unions, including in our public safety and our police oversight work, where many of the accountability improvements, which I think are on the table or which are necessary or possible, run up against or at least alongside the collective bargaining agreement protections for the police. And so we certainly see those issues and see those actors.
In all those investigations, do you have any favorites? Do you have any?
We love all of our investigations.
My wife is always listening to these different investigative podcasts, and she's always intrigued by some of the interesting factoids and things that you find. What are a couple of interesting things that you've found after some digging?
Well, as I say, we love all of our investigations the same. But I think, and much of our investigative work.
Spoken like a true mother.
Thank you. Yes. Much of our investigative work is confidential by law, and so there's only so much that we'll say about that. I think one thing we worked on in recent memory, which was of great interest to me, and I think some other folks as well, had to do with the enforcement of the city's rules around gifts and the accepting of gifts on behalf of the city. That work arose out of some of our ethics enforcement efforts and our new efforts, really, in the office's history at enforcing the city's ethics rules. There are rules that govern when and how city officials can accept gifts, including a special category of rules around gifts accepted on behalf of the city. Those rules are designed to accommodate things like public art installations that might be donated to the city, things that might be on display at City Hall or at the Harold Washington Library or whatever the case may be. And the rules say that if a city official accepts a gift on behalf of the city, it has to be publicly reported to the comptroller and to the Board of Ethics, and then made available to the public on whose behalf the gift is accepted. We learned in the course of some of our investigative travels that the mayor's office, for decades, going back to Eugene Sawyer, had not been following the generally applicable rules around gifts accepted on behalf of the city, but instead, pursuant to an unwritten agreement, which in my experience in ethics enforcement is rarely a sign of good things. Pursuant to an unwritten agreement, the mayor's office was keeping its own records in a logbook on the 5th floor of City Hall. And so we sent some undercover investigators to the 5th floor of City Hall, and they asked to see the logbook. They were told that it wasn't available. They'd have to submit a Freedom of Information Act request. And so we did that, again, in a covert capacity, because the interest there was to see, this is public information, and information about the government belongs to the governed. And so the interest here was not initially to see what we could find out about it, but what any Chicagoan could find out about this. These gifts were accepted on behalf of Chicagoans. We were interested in finding out what those people might be able to learn. And so we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, again, not disclosing ourselves as the requester. The mayor's office did not respond to that request, and so then and only then did we send a regular compelled OIG document request for records associated with gifts accepted on behalf of the city, and we got back a gift log that included gifts, cufflinks and pens and men's shoes and so on. And some of those gifts were identified as being stored in what was called the mayor's gift room. And so we sent some investigators back to City Hall, this time very much in an overt capacity, and asked to see the gift room. And the law department declined our access to the gift room, which I think led to a really interesting conversation about two things. One, about the underlying gift rules and the need to align reporting with the rules. But also just sort of receptiveness to oversight and transparency. I talk a lot about the fact that we have, again, for many decades, given Chicagoans every reason to mistrust what happens in windowless rooms at City Hall. Until we did that work, I thought that was sort of like a metaphorical description of things that happen at City Hall. This is a very literal windowless room to which our access was denied. So I think, and actually I will say, I think much of what drove public interest in that story was the kind of refusal to subject those practices to sunlight. So that was a recent interesting one. And
certainly one, it sounds like it resulted in efficiencies or in a system, in a structure, right?
Yes. Yes, where there's now a commitment to at least to follow the public reporting rules that apply to.
And is that usual, where I imagine that's a goal you're investigating so that you can get to a result that's better. Has that happened in your, it's been since 2022 now, I imagine you can point back to some specific examples where, other examples where it has happened.
Yes, we can. Sometimes those sorts of improvements are a little bit an article of faith because things move at the speed of government, and it can be very hard to identify responsive changes. But sometimes we do see successes. Another one that I often think about in terms of a concretely visible improvement in response to our work had to do with consecutive days worked by members of the police department. So this is a conversation that comes around every year, often in the summer when things get very busy. We have lots of members of the police department working lots of days in a row without any time off. Days off get canceled. That leads to all kinds of questions about staffing and overtime and who we need where. And we looked at this. We looked at this question of because this is one of many policy questions, particularly around public safety in this city, where there are more opinions than there are good data sources. And so we have all the data. And so we looked at this question of of what the working conditions really look like. And we found that for this very narrow sample of time in the spring, so not even in the really busy summer months, there were over 1,000 CPD members had been scheduled to work at least 11 days in a row, sometimes much longer, without any time off. That is many more days without rest than we would allow medical doctors or airline pilots or truck drivers to work, because there is a recognition that it's not safe for people to work without adequate rest. And so, we had police officers with guns on city streets where we would not have allowed truck drivers to drive under the same working conditions. And so we published that analysis, and the next day the city changed the rules around the cancellation of days off. So days off still get canceled, but under narrower circumstances. And while that has by no means solved the problem of police staffing, I think that was an important change.
I imagine obviously we've talked a lot about investigations. I imagine other ways to make government more efficient is to look at best practices around the country. Have there been other cases in other cities where you said, hey, this is something that really could apply to our city government here in Chicago and make things more efficient or more innovative?
Yeah, I think there's tremendous power in best practice analysis, and we do a lot of that in our program and policy work, both in public safety and in our audit and program review work, where we look at non-police city services. Sometimes best practice comparisons are hard because, there are many exceptional things about Chicago. There's a lot of exceptionalism around the idea that everything is different here and all of our problems are special. There's a lot to be learned from other cities. And, we, for example, we're doing some work around rat abatement and the way that the city's efforts to control rodent populations kind of fit in among city services. Chicago is by no means the only city in America to deal with a rat problem, right? So there's a lot to learn. I actually think that best practice comparisons and best practice research is an area where policy and research and academic organizations outside of government have tremendous potential for valuable contributions. There are some things that can and should be done by the government. There are other things where we don't necessarily have any special magic, where I think there are huge contributions to be made, as I say, by outside policy and research and academic institutions. Best practice research is one of those areas.
That's music to our ears at City Club, where we bring together academics and philanthropists and lawmakers and enforcement agencies.
That's why I'm a City Club superfan.
Exactly. So we appreciate that, because there's so much of that collaboration that's going on that really guides what is going to happen here. And I mentioned that there's some students and young folks here. Hope you're listening and understanding that you can be a part of that solution. And also take, maybe what's applied in other cities. We talk about other cities, but maybe other sectors and other companies and other departments even within the city, and see what works among others. A lot of that takes open minds. Have you had open minds in City Hall in the last couple of years?
Have we had open minds in City Hall? I think the work we are doing is making an impact.
Let's ask this way. So, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I think what is important is understanding that what you're doing is not just to dig up something that's wrong.
No, that's right. That's right.
It's meant to improve a process, right?
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And I very much think of the work we do in three channels. We do misconduct investigations. We do administrative and criminal misconduct investigations when people are breaking the rules. The second channel of that work is the kind of program and policy work we're talking a little bit about here, where we are looking at whether things could operate, whether we can do it better. And then the third channel of the work is transparency work, animated by this principle we've talked about, that information about the government belongs to the governed. there is a lot of information here and in other governments which is theoretically publicly available, right? People can submit FOIA requests. Many people in this room have done that. That is a challenging and cumbersome exercise. There's a big difference between information being theoretically publicly available and meaningfully publicly accessible. I am a firm believer in sunlight as an antiseptic, that transparency goes a long way toward making things better. People can't improve what they can't understand or what they can't measure. And so all that is to say, it's absolutely right that some of the work we do is very much focused on identifying people who have broken the rules and what should happen. But much of it is not. Much of it is genuinely about making government work better for people who are entitled to a lot from their government.
Okay, so I'm going to get in trouble because I said I was going to put you on the spot, but it's school season. I dropped my kids off yesterday, their first day. Let's talk grades.
Yeah.
If you were to grade this city administration, let's just talk about transparency. Maybe we hit a couple different things. How about transparency? If you were to grade this administration on transparency, what would that grade be?
Well, Dan, I was a Montessori kid. We don't do letter grades.
That is an out if I've ever heard one. I think there are some things to worry about this city's current posture with respect to transparency and reform efforts. We should all approach our work with the fundamental understanding that people deserve better than what they have gotten from their government in this city. And the way that will change is for the city to become a proactive driver of reform, not a reluctant subject of it. Interesting. How about a grade? How about that specifically on crime and public safety reform?
Yeah.
That again, we started with talking about how some of those stats, it looks like things have gotten better. If you were to grade that, is that getting better? How much more work needs to be done on that front?
There's that expression, like, does anyone have any questions for my answers? I'm just going to tell you what I have to say about this. I'm not sure it answers the question.
That's all right.
I think probably the closest thing that the city has to a grade, a report card at this point on these issues is the consent decree that was entered in Illinois versus Chicago. And that's something of a grim story at the moment, I think. So the consent decree in Illinois versus Chicago was entered in 2019. We are 6.5 years into that effort. And the city has reached operational compliance. That is, they've demonstrated actual change on the street with a very small number of the requirements imposed by that document. We should all be concerned about that. I have described the consent decree compliance effort as, like if you're riding a bicycle and you pedal too slowly, you tip over. I think we should all worry about whether we are pedaling too slowly on the consent decree and whether it's going to tip over as a result. Now, the consent decree is a 799 paragraph document. It covers many, many things in the city's public safety operations. It is not and was never going to be kind of the reform omnibus. It's not the only solution. It was never going to be a perfect solution. But I think there's plenty to worry about whether it's going to be a meaningful solution and whether the many years and many, many millions of dollars that have been spent on it, whether that's an expenditure or an investment from which we should expect a good return.
Sure. Okay, I'll stop on the grades because I understand the Montessori piece of it. So. but let's talk a little.
Tuition dollars well spent.
A little more about City Council.
Yeah.
With this, and I'm jokingly calling it a newfound responsibility, but there's so much more engagement.
Yeah.
How are they handling that? Their 50 city council members, for those of you who may not know that or come to City Club often. So it's hard to put them all in one category, but how is the city council moving with these times and with this, this newfound engagement in overall government?
Well, that is, I think, a story that is still very much being written. I don't know if we know yet, although I really do think, for the reasons we've talked about, I think there is much to be hopeful about in terms of city council's engagement in the work of improving city government and in the real work of legislative oversight. I mean, one of the tricky things about our city council and the way it's built is that we have a very large number of city council members for the city's population, and those members are both responsible for being the sort of conduit for city services in their ward, in their fiefdom, but they are also responsible for exercising legislative oversight. Those are very different responsibilities and not always necessarily in alignment. So I think that's a challenging and interesting structure. There are many city council committees organized by subject matter. Some of them meet a lot and do a lot. Some of them meet never and do nothing, at least in a public-facing way. And so, you know, there's a lot, we'll see. There are certainly opportunities for growth, I think, in City Council. We published a report just in the last week or so making the observation that there's a City Council committee which has among the things under its authority, the regulation of the conduct of City Council members. That's the Committee on Committees and Rules, which is sort of a mouthful, but so each committee has this subject matter jurisdiction. The Committee on Rules has the conduct of members, as I say, under its jurisdiction, and they have never undertaken to sort of meet that mandate. They have never taken any action to govern the conduct of city council members. That's an opportunity. That is a gap in the city's governance and accountability structure, and so we made some recommendations to the committee that they develop a process. There's one kind of laid out in Robert's Rules of Order, which the City Council incorporates by reference in its own rules. There's a real opportunity there for the City Council to kind of grow into its mandate.
And one of the things they have done is improve these ethic rules, right? I don't think it was a coincidence that you announced very soon after that was passed that you weren't going to seek a second term. As Inspector General, do you feel like your work there, like you could say, okay, I've done enough, my work here is done? Was that intentional to wait until that got passed?
It was certainly not a coincidence. And while the work is a long way from done, I do think that these legislative changes that you mentioned that we talked about a few minutes ago, which go to protect the independence and the effectiveness of the office, it is not a perfect solution by any means. The legislation we ended up with was kind of a compromise solution. Like all good compromises, it's not quite what anybody wants all the time. But it's a really meaningful improvement, I think, including to resolve some issues that this office has been battling on for 20 years. So I think, however imperfect, I think that piece of legislation, which again got very broad support in City Council, was a really meaningful improvement. And it was the passage of that legislation that made me feel confident that by the time this term is up in April, I can pass along a more effective, more independent office to the next person lucky enough to do the job.
And what are you going to do between now and April?
We will have plenty to say between now and April. There's a lot of good work getting done, and we will have plenty to say about it between now and then.
Okay, we look forward to that. And to whoever may be, one thing I wanted to make sure we understood here, especially the young folks, that from this is probably not a career path many people decide to pursue, right? I'd like to be the Inspector General. I want to investigate wrongdoing. Maybe for some, but once you get in there, I think that you have this really interesting insight into how everything works, or how it doesn't work, or how it can work. How it can work better. That gives you a pretty broad perspective. So if there were young people in the room that might be a successor or might eventually be a successor, what would your advice to them be earlier on in their careers? And would you guide people down this path? that you have found or taken or formed?
Boy, does that depend on the day. No, I think, well, I guess I'll say two things. I am a firm believer in public service. It's always been my intention to spend a career in public service. That's what I went to law school to do. It's the only kind of career I've ever been able to imagine having. And so I think that's a good reason to undertake a career. We hire a lot of people. I do a lot of job interviews, and I sometimes find that people in those interviews are, I ask them, like, what brings you to us? What interests you about this work? And people are sort of sheepish about saying, I just want to do good in the world, and maybe people think that sounds naive, or it sounds, I don't know. That's a good answer. That's the right answer, actually. It is everyone's responsibility to do what they can do to make the world a better place, and that's a good and a straight-faced answer. And you should be pursuing jobs that allow you to say that that's why you want to do them. The other thing I will say about this kind of work specifically is that I have come to see that work like this, which is really important and really rewarding and really hard, it's neither a sprint nor a marathon. This is a relay race. And those of us who have the tremendous privilege of working in public service should approach those jobs that way, as a relay race. It is our responsibility to run as hard as we can while it's our turn. And then once we've gained some ground, to pass the baton. We would all be better off if people viewed, especially jobs in leadership and public service, in that way.
All right, so you're going to pass the baton, and then where are you going to go?
What am I going to do when I grow up? Is that the, I don't know.
April's coming soon, right?
It sure is. It sure is. I don't know. I sincerely don't know. As I say, it has always been my intention to spend a career in public service. That continues to be my plan.
Great. Well, we look forward to hearing more about that.
Me too.
And what you have, in store through April. I do, as I mentioned, I'd like to ask some questions. I have some pre-submitted. We have about 10 minutes. So please, if you do have a question, raise your hand. We've got one up front, Caleb, and we've got one in back. Let's start in back since Caleb's in the back, and then we'll come up and get to you, I promise.
Okay.
And please introduce yourself and your organization.
Yes, absolutely. My name is Andrew White. I'm here with several members, alumni of the Harris School of Public Policy, so excited to be here. I am really interested in some of the stuff that Mayor Johnson has been doing with community safety, and I'm just wondering from your perspective if you have any insights on sort of the efforts thus far and how they may be impacted by the budget challenges that seem to be coming on the horizon.
This is a great question. Meaningful improvements in violence reduction will come through an approach which is not bound by the four walls of the police department. So I think the Johnson administration is very much to be commended for focusing on the importance of a whole of government approach to public safety and to violence reduction. That's the only way we're going to do it. We are not going to police our way out of public safety challenges, policing alone. So I think that's the only way that's going to work. And I think that while there surely are budget challenges, that work, like all the other work of the city, will have to kind of be shaped around budget challenges. An interdisciplinary whole of government approach is the only one that's going to get us there.
Thank you for that, Caleb. Well, we do have folks online watching. If you don't mind introducing yourself. Thanks. At the mic.
Mike Zaleski from Taft.
Thank you.
Probably can't answer. But what was the cover story that the agents used originally to see the gift room?
That's a good one.
What did they say they were there for? If you can answer. You probably can't answer, but it's worth a shot.
Well, I will just say that, what will I say? The notion was that the records about the gifts were publicly accessible, that they were being stored at City Hall for viewing by the public. And the way government information should work, like, look, to be clear, we are both in the business of transparency and we have tremendous confidentiality obligations, and balancing those things is among the most challenging things we do. So to be clear, there are certain things in government which need to be confidential, but the way this ought to work, the presumption should be that the public gets access to public information. And you work sort of down from there, where if there are things that need to be confidential to protect whistleblowers or to protect law enforcement sensitive information or because of grand jury rules or the Bank Secrecy Act or whatever, those things stay confidential. But the presumption should be that information about the government belongs to the governed. And so members of the public should not need a cover story. They should not need an explanation for why they should get access to information about their government. Quite the opposite. The government should have to explain why information should be kept from public view.
All right, any other questions? Right in the center here.
My name is Prue Beidler, and I'm a very active member of the Deborah Witzburg fan club. My question actually is a little bit on the best practice, Deborah. And it seemed to me that in a number of the pieces I've seen in journals in the city, and I'm thrilled that there's so much coverage of the office and that you're always so candid, it's incredibly helpful and reassuring. To have had you in that position. You have often mentioned, and at least certainly it feels like in the last year and maybe even before, comparisons to what's happening other places and best practices other places. I'm not sure I've seen any city official do that before. I mean, I think there's always this sense of, this word exceptionalism, which we've also heard applied to our country and seems a little dubious at the moment to me, candidly. But I do think, not being willing to consider what other organizations that are similar are doing, what they might be doing that could inform you, is a huge mistake. And it feels to me like that's something that has pretty dramatically changed. Can you talk about how that adds value to the work you do?
Yeah. It's always a relief to have one's mother-in-law praise one's candor, so I'll take that. I think there's tremendous value to be realized from this. There are, wheels only need to be invented one time. And wherever we are battling problems that have been confronted other places, we are making a huge mistake and we are wasting precious and finite resources if we are not learning both from what has and from what has not worked in other places. And so I think that, as improvements in information sharing and so on kind of coincide with an effort, with an increased interest in doing that, that's all good news. And while there are some unique things about Chicago and its challenges, there are many, many things where there is common ground between both problems and solutions here and elsewhere. So I think it's a tremendous value add. I think that as we look to do more with less in a very resource-constrained environment, there is tremendous potential in learning lessons from other cities.
Great. We could have one more if we have any on the floor, and if not, I'll have. Oh.
Hi, Deborah. David Greising from the Better Government Association. You talked about the bicycle of police reform being at risk of falling over. Yeah, we've seen reduced crime statistics in the last couple of years. To what extent are improvements from the consent decree accountable for some of the improvements we're seeing? What are the shortcomings in compliance so far that might cause that bicycle to fall over?
Yeah.
And related but slightly different, private institutions and government have committed more than $300 million toward violence reduction in this city. Is any of that doing any measurable good?
Yeah. So I think the first part of your question kind of goes back to where we started, which is that there's some good news in crime statistics. I think there's a less clear picture about cause and to what causes we can attribute those reductions in crime rates. As that observation kind of sits alongside consent decree compliance, reform happens on the street and not on the paper. and important to say, as we look back over the 6.5 years that the consent decree has been in effect, there has in very recent history been a pretty dramatic uptick in the city's operational compliance. Now that's from single digits to mid-teens, so it's not a great news story, but in a relative way, it's a real it is a real improvement, and I think leadership matters, and there's a lot to be said about kind of the level of commitment to those changes in current leadership at the police department. But if we're at somewhere in the mid-teens of percentage of consent decree requirements with which the city has complied out on the street corners of the city, I think it's hard to argue that is driving a reduction in violent crime. I just don't think it is, probably, or at least not in a way that we can demonstrate. Challenges around reform and the pace of reform. There are at least 2 necessary ingredients to effective reform, and those are the resources to get it done and the political will to do it. And I am not sure that in a consistent way over the last 6 years we've had both of those things. And not to say that the combination of those things is sufficient, it is certainly necessary. Reform takes resources. And so, one of the things I worry about is staffing levels, separate from questions about sworn member staffing in the police department, staffing of positions which are devoted to the work of reform. Reform is not a wish for it exercise. There's work to do, and there have to be people to do it. I worry about whether we have allocated the resources that it requires. We need to allocate those resources. We've got to fill those jobs. We've got to have people doing the work. And there has to be the political will to make it happen. And the violence, and the money. I think, so you're right, a great deal of money has been invested from non-government sources in violence reduction work. I think that kind of goes back to the community safety question of what this landscape looks like. Cause is really hard. The same observation here. I think identifying a causal relationship between community violence interruption work and a reduction in violent crime is very challenging. I also think it's probably very real. I think much of that work is probably effective for lots of reasons. Everything we know about kind of the way human behavior works and the way that kind of a holistic approach to social services and so on can have a meaningful and a positive impact. More research, more empirical research demonstrating a causal relationship between community violence intervention work and a reduction in crime would serve us all well.
Thank you for that, David. Here at City Club, we so much appreciate innovation, leadership, public service, of course, the progress that has been made and that we continue to make, and of course, a transparency. And thank you for agreeing to share so many of these thoughts and so many insights that you've gained and have been able to share. We hope you will come back. I do have some more questions for next time. But we very much appreciate you being here and being so forthright with all of your comments. Thank you to our Inspector General, Deborah Witzburg.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And Dan, I will just very quickly say that there are a bunch of folks from my office here who are the people doing the good and the hard work that makes it all happen. So I'm very grateful for their work and for their being here.
Thank you. And that table over there, we do appreciate you so much. We also appreciate all of you for being here, as I mentioned earlier, and hope that you'll all come back soon, but not just for the IG. We do have, just Thursday, we have Congressman Mike Quigley is coming back here this Thursday, the 28th, and then Uniting for a Cure, a breast cancer research consortium, different hospitals on September 2nd. How we heal with the Building Connection and Solidarity in Divided Times with Kellogg Foundation and the Joyce Foundation on September 8th. The Current State of Immigration on September 9th. Inside the Chicago Architectural Biennial on September 11th. This is going to be quite a month at City Club. Closing the Housing Gap on September 22nd. Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart on September 23rd. Wow. Commissioner Randy Connor from the Water Department, you know Commissioner Connor. That one sold out. A couple of these are sold out. They're on September 30th. What a month. That's September. I'm going to be busy. Shoot, that was a good reminder. But I hope you'll all come back. I hope you'll have your questions. I hope you'll continue these discussions that are so important and that really help move this city and this state forward with incredible leaders like Deb Witzburg. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy this last week before Labor Day, and see you all back here at City Club soon.